Police officers humiliated a black activist, not knowing what lay ahead of them. Support our channel. Subscribe, share this video, and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Amanda Williams adjusted her rearview mirror with a practiced hand, her gaze catching the dim glow of the streetlights dotting the long, empty road ahead. It was late, later than she'd anticipated leaving the city meeting, but her heart was light, filled with that quiet satisfaction that always followed progress. The evening had been productive. She and her team had made significant strides in planning their next community outreach program, one aimed at educating people in marginalized neighborhoods about their civil rights, particularly when it came to law enforcement. It was work Amanda had dedicated her life to, work that kept her spirit sharp, even when the burden of the fight threatened to wear her thin. Amanda exhaled softly, shifting her focus back to the road as the audiobook she'd been listening to droned on. The words of the narrator filled the space around her like a steady rhythm, recounting the struggles of other activists, of history's defiant voices who had risen up against a system designed to silence them. It was a balm, a reassurance that she was part of something bigger than herself. "We are our ancestors' wildest dreams," she thought, the words her mother used to whisper when Amanda was a little girl, clutching her hand tightly as they walked past a line of chanting protesters. Her car, though not brand new, hummed smoothly as it cut through the silence of the night. She'd grown fond of the vehicle, with its scuffed door handle and the faint hum that always surfaced when the heat was turned too high. A symbol of independence. Amanda glanced at the passenger seat, where a battered leather notebook sat atop her purse, its pages worn from years of scribbled ideas, strategies, and collected experiences. It had been with her since college, and now it was her constant companion, a silent witness to her work. Ahead, the road stretched like a ribbon of darkness, interrupted only by the occasional glow of a gas station or roadside diner. Amanda adjusted her grip on the steering wheel and felt a familiar sense of isolation creeping in. She was used to being alone, at least physically. The work she did didn't allow for much downtime, nor for the kind of relationships others often took for granted. It was a trade-off she had long accepted, but on nights like this, the silence had a way of settling deep in her bones. Suddenly, red and blue lights flared in her rearview mirror. Amanda blinked, her heart skipping an involuntary beat. She slowed the car gradually, signaling and pulling to the side of the road. The patrol car followed, its siren cutting off abruptly, leaving only the pulse of flashing lights casting sharp streaks across her dashboard. Amanda gripped the wheel tightly, her breathing shallow as she watched the shadowy figures moving in the cruiser's headlights. 2 doors opened, and out stepped the officers, silhouettes against the blinding glare. Her stomach knotted, but her expression remained composed as she rolled down her window and reached for her ID and registration. Experience had taught her well. Keep your movements deliberate, your voice calm, and your words measured. The first officer approached her window, a tall, imposing man whose build seemed designed to intimidate. The reflective badge on his chest read Hampton. He leaned down slightly, his sharp features illuminated under the harsh light. Behind him lingered a second officer, younger and leaner, his hands tucked stiffly at his belt as though unsure where to put them. His expression was blank, almost hesitant, but Amanda didn't miss the tension radiating off him. "License and registration," Hampton said. His voice was low and clipped, devoid of any polite pretense. Amanda held out the documents calmly, her gaze steady as it met his. "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" Hampton glanced at her papers briefly before leveling his gaze back at her. The smirk curling at the edge of his mouth sent a chill down her spine. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Your car matches the description." Amanda's brow furrowed, her pulse quickening as she searched his face for sincerity. "Suspicious activity? Officer, I'm coming from a meeting downtown. I haven't broken any laws." Hampton straightened, tucking her documents into his chest pocket without a word. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably a few feet away, his eyes darting between his superior and Amanda. "You seem awfully nervous," Hampton remarked casually, stepping back a half step to scan her car with an exaggerated slowness. His flashlight beamed into the back seat, lingering longer than necessary. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle, ma'am?" Amanda's hands instinctively clenched into fists against her lap. A wave of indignation rose inside her, but she forced it down. She knew better than to argue, not here, not alone on a dark road. "Is that necessary? I've already provided my—" "It wasn't a request." Hampton's voice sharpened like a knife. Amanda's chest tightened. Slowly, she pushed open her door and stepped out into the cool night air. The second officer, Hendricks, if his name tag was any indication, remained silent but shifted slightly, as if his discomfort were palpable. Amanda's mind raced as she stood there, her breath visible in the night. "Turn around. Hands on the hood," Hampton ordered. Amanda froze. "No." Her heart pounded as she stared at him, words catching in her throat. This was it. The moment she'd read about, heard about, marched against. Her skin prickled and her knees felt weak, but she turned slowly, pressing her palms flat against the cold metal of the car. The beam of the flashlight danced over her back. "Got something to hide, sweetheart?" Hampton sneered, his tone laced with cruel amusement. Amanda squeezed her eyes shut as he stepped closer, invading her space. She flinched as she felt his hands against her sides, pressing roughly as he patted her down. Every touch was a violation. Every word he muttered an insult to her dignity. Behind her, she could hear Hendricks shifting again, his footsteps a restless echo in the night. "This is harassment," Amanda said finally, her voice trembling but defiant. "I've done nothing wrong." Hampton ignored her, his hands pausing at her hips before lingering longer than necessary. "You'd be surprised how many innocents turn out to be hiding something." Amanda felt her teeth grit, anger flooding her veins as her mind screamed at her to fight back, to say more, to do something. But she didn't move. Instead, her breath hitched as Hampton leaned closer, his voice dropping low. "You think you're somebody important, don't you?" he murmured, his words venomous. "Activist or not, you're nobody out here." Amanda's shoulders stiffened. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. The humiliation of it all, of standing here, powerless, reduced to someone else's amusement, burned her like a fire. From the corner of her eye, she saw Hendricks look away, his jaw clenched. The boy couldn't meet her gaze, and in that moment, Amanda's fury crystallized into something colder, harder, a promise. "You'll pay for this." Hampton stepped back finally, his smirk widening as he withdrew his hands. "All clear," he announced mockingly. What a shock. Amanda turned around slowly, her face pale and her eyes blazing. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "I'll make sure of it." Hampton only laughed, turning back toward the cruiser as though she were no more significant than the dirt beneath his shoes. Hendricks lingered a moment longer, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but Hampton barked his name sharply, and he followed. As the patrol car pulled away, Amanda stood in the empty road, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The silence pressed in around her like a heavy fog, broken only by the distant rumble of the cruiser's engine fading into the distance. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. The camera app blinked to life, the lens reflecting her tear-streaked face. Amanda inhaled shakily, her voice hoarse as she pressed record. "You need to hear this story," she began. Amanda sat in her car for several minutes after the officers left, her body rigid, her mind a battlefield of emotions. The glow from her phone's screen illuminated the tear-streaked contours of her face as the video finished recording. She hadn't prepared the words. They had simply tumbled out of her mouth, raw, unfiltered, carrying the weight of her rage and humiliation. "They pulled me over for no reason." Amanda's voice trembled in the recording, but her eyes were hard, unblinking. "They put their hands on me. They touched me, humiliated me, and acted like it was their right, like I didn't matter because of my skin, because I dared to challenge their authority. But this is not okay. This is not justice, and this will not be the end of it." Her hands shook as she uploaded the video to her social media pages, captioning it simply, "When will this stop? #justice needed #police accountability." She stared at the loading bar as it filled, as though it carried a promise of action, of consequences. Then she sat back, her heart pounding as the dark road stretched endlessly around her. Amanda knew she had just lit a match, and all it needed now was a gust of wind to turn into a wildfire. The first ping came almost immediately. Someone commenting on her post, then another. Soon, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Amanda watched in stunned silence as her story began spreading like ripples in a pond. Shares, retweets, comments, people from all over were responding, outraged, furious, demanding answers. Her friend Selena called less than an hour later. "Amanda?" Selena's voice was tight with concern. "I just saw your video. Are you okay? Where are you right now?" "I'm on the way home," Amanda replied, her voice hoarse. "I'm fine. Physically, at least." "You're not fine. What they did to you, Amanda, this is harassment, assault. I can't even—" Selena stopped, her voice breaking slightly. "You're brave for speaking out. Do you need me to come over?" Amanda hesitated. The offer was tempting, but what she wanted most was to be alone, to process everything that had happened. "Not tonight. Tomorrow, maybe. I need some time." "All right," Selena said, her voice softening. "But promise me you'll call if you need anything." Amanda hung up, driving the rest of the way in silence. When she reached her apartment, a modest two-bedroom nestled in an older building, the weight of the evening crashed down on her like a wave. She tossed her bag onto the couch, sank to the floor, and let the tears flow freely this time. It wasn't just the physical violation that haunted her, the feel of Hampton's hands at her waist, his mocking tone in her ear. It was the helplessness. The knowledge that they believed they could get away with it because they wore badges, that her word against theirs might mean nothing. She didn't know how long she sat there, curled up on the carpet as her sobs quieted to ragged breaths. Eventually, Amanda pushed herself to her feet, washed her face in the bathroom, and pulled out her notebook. She flipped to a blank page and began writing, detailing every moment of the encounter, the words spoken, the actions taken, the exact way she had felt. Every line was sharp, deliberate, evidence for the fight ahead. By morning, Amanda's video had gone viral. The media had picked it up, major networks replaying her calm but fiery words against the backdrop of flashing police lights. Headlines screamed, "Activist claims police harassment. Is this abuse of power?" And "Viral video reignites conversation on racial profiling." Amanda's phone didn't stop ringing. Local journalists wanted interviews. Activist groups reached out to offer support. Angry messages flooded her inbox, some offering solidarity, others filled with hate. Selena arrived mid-morning, armed with coffee and a look of determination. "You're the top story everywhere," she said, setting 2 cups down on the kitchen table. "People are listening, Amanda." Amanda glanced at her phone, its screen alive with a constant flurry of activity. "That's what scares me," she murmured. "What happens now?" "We fight," Selena said firmly. "You didn't ask for this, but it's here, and you're strong enough to handle it." Amanda swallowed hard. She had always believed in standing up for others, but now she was the face of something bigger, a movement demanding justice. The weight of it was heavy, but it was also fuel. Later that day, Amanda's attorney, David Morris, arrived at her apartment. He was a tall, lean man in his late 40s with silvering hair and the composed demeanor of someone who had seen it all. "Miss Williams, I saw your video," he began, shaking her hand. "First, I want to say I'm sorry for what you've been through. What happened was a violation, plain and simple. I'm here to help you hold them accountable." Amanda nodded, pulling out the notebook where she had recorded every detail. "I wrote everything down," she said, handing it to him. "I didn't want to forget anything." David flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. "This is good, thorough, but we'll need more. Witnesses, video evidence, anything to strengthen your case." "There were people there," Amanda said, a flicker of hope in her voice. "Some of them were filming." "Good," David replied, setting the notebook aside. "I'll reach out to them and we'll start building the case. But be prepared, Amanda. This won't be easy. They're going to attack your credibility. They'll try to make it about you instead of what they did." "I know," Amanda said quietly, "but I'm ready." David studied her for a moment before nodding. "I believe you are, and you won't be alone in this." Over the next few days, Amanda's story became a rallying cry. Protests erupted downtown, led by local activists carrying signs that read, "Justice for Amanda," and "End Police Abuse." The sound of chants and drums echoed through the streets, a chorus of anger and unity. Amanda stood among the crowds, her presence both a symbol of strength and a reminder of the work still ahead. The media hounded the police department for a statement. The pressure mounted until the department finally announced an internal investigation into the actions of Officer Mark Hampton and his team. But Amanda knew better than to celebrate. She had seen investigations before, how they often amounted to little more than empty gestures. She wasn't going to let this disappear quietly. Late one evening, Amanda received an email from a young woman named Jasmine. "I saw your video. The same officer did something similar to me a year ago, but I was too afraid to speak up. I'm ready to share my story now." Amanda stared at the message, her heart pounding. Jasmine's story was a crack in the wall, proof that what had happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. She forwarded the message to David immediately. "We're not alone," Amanda thought, a spark of resolve igniting in her chest. She knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but for the first time Amanda felt like victory was possible. The morning sunlight poured into Amanda's apartment through the sheer curtains, but there was no warmth to it, not for her. She sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, feeling the weight of every headline, every message, every share of her video. It had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the media like wildfire. News outlets were covering it non-stop, local and national alike. Some were calling her brave. Others questioned her motives, twisting the narrative into something that fit their bias. Words like sensationalist and playing the victim crept into the conversation from certain commentators, but the majority of voices were clear. Something had to change. Amanda's coffee sat untouched, going cold as she sifted through her notifications. There were messages of encouragement and solidarity. "Thank you for speaking up. This is happening to too many people." "I'm with you, Amanda. Stay strong." But mixed among them were messages of hate, threats thinly veiled behind anonymous accounts. "Liar, you're trying to ruin good cops." "Watch your back. You don't know who you're messing with." Amanda sighed and placed her phone face down on the table. Selena, sitting across from her with her own laptop open, noticed the shift in her demeanor. "Stop reading those," Selena said softly, reaching over to squeeze Amanda's hand. "You know what's real. That's all that matters." Amanda nodded, but her jaw tightened. "It's not just about me anymore," she said, her voice low but steady. "This is bigger. If I back down now, I'm letting them win. I can't let them silence me or anyone else." Selena's eyes softened, filled with pride. "Then let's make sure your voice gets even louder." The protests began 2 days later, and they were bigger than Amanda could have imagined. At first, it was just a small group of activists standing in front of the police department, holding signs and chanting demands for accountability. But word spread quickly, and soon hundreds of people flooded the streets, their collective voice shaking the very foundations of the city. Amanda stood at the heart of it, surrounded by the energy of the crowd. She felt the weight of their hope, their anger, their shared desire for justice. Signs filled the air. "Justice for Amanda! Stop police abuse! Black Lives Matter!" Reporters swarmed the protest, cameras capturing every chant, every raised fist, every tear-streaked face. Amanda's name became a rallying cry, but it wasn't just about her anymore. Her story had opened the floodgates, and now others were coming forward. People who had remained silent for years, afraid of what speaking out might cost them. That afternoon, Amanda took the microphone on a makeshift stage set up at the edge of the crowd. Her voice boomed through the speakers, trembling but resolute as thousands of faces turned toward her. "This isn't just about one incident," Amanda began, her eyes scanning the sea of people. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's ever been harassed, humiliated, or harmed by a system that was supposed to protect them. It's about the fear that comes when the people with power abuse it, and the silence that follows because we're too scared to speak up. Well, I'm not afraid anymore, and I know I'm not alone." The crowd roared in response, applause and cheers shaking the ground beneath her feet. Amanda gripped the microphone tighter, her words pouring out like a flood. "We are here to demand justice, not just for me, but for every single person whose story was ignored, whose dignity was stripped away, and whose voice was silenced. We are done being quiet. We are done being afraid. We are done letting them get away with this." The cheers grew louder, swelling like a wave. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back, tears burning her eyes. For the first time in days, she felt powerful, unstoppable. The media frenzy intensified as Amanda's story evolved into something larger, a movement. News anchors debated it on live television. Pundits argued about systemic racism and abuse of power. Prominent civil rights leaders joined the cause, calling for reform and accountability. David Morris, Amanda's attorney, met with her and Selena late one evening in his office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and case files. "Your case is strong. David said, rubbing his temples as he scanned through the latest updates. "We've got witness testimonies, video evidence, and now other victims are coming forward. I've spoken to 2 women already who had similar experiences with Officer Hampton. One of them, Jasmine, filed a complaint last year, but it was dismissed." Amanda's fists clenched at the mention of Jasmine. "Dismissed? How?" "Internal investigation found no wrongdoing," David said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "They buried it, but not this time." Amanda sat back, shaking her head in disbelief. "How many more people have to go through this before something changes?" "As many as it takes," Selena said quietly, "until they can't ignore us anymore." Meanwhile, the police department was in damage control mode. The chief issued a public statement promising a thorough and unbiased investigation into Amanda's allegations. But behind closed doors, Officer Hampton and his supporters within the force were circling their wagons. Hampton sat in a dimly lit break room at the station, his face flushed with anger as he slammed a newspaper onto the table. The headline read, "Activist accuses police of assault. Calls for accountability grow louder." "This is a goddamn witch hunt," Hampton spat, glaring at his younger colleague, Officer Hendricks, who sat silently across the table. "She's making a spectacle out of nothing, and now they're dragging my name through the mud." Hendricks didn't respond. He hadn't been able to sleep since that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amanda's face, her anger, her humiliation, her defiance. The weight of his silence pressed on him like a boulder. "You got something to say, Hendricks?" Hampton snapped, his voice sharp. Hendricks swallowed hard. "No, sir." Hampton narrowed his eyes. "Good. Keep it that way. This'll blow over soon enough." But Hendricks wasn't so sure. That evening, Amanda received a message from an anonymous number. At first, she almost ignored it, assuming it was another threat. But as she read the text, her pulse quickened. "I saw what happened. I was there. I'm ready to tell the truth." Amanda stared at the screen, her mind racing. Could it be one of the officers? She forwarded the message to David, who immediately began working to confirm its origin. "This could be a game changer," David told her on the phone. "If we can get someone from inside the department to testify, it'll blow their defense apart." Amanda nodded, clutching her phone tightly. "Then let's make it happen." As the days passed, the protests grew larger, the media coverage more intense. People from all over the country were watching Amanda's case, and the pressure on the police department was mounting. Selena sat with Amanda one night as they watched footage of the protests on the news. Thousands of people filled the streets, their chants echoing through the screen. "Look at this," Selena said, smiling faintly. "You did this. You gave them a reason to stand up." Amanda shook her head. "We did this. All of us. And we're not done yet." Her phone buzzed again, and Amanda's heart skipped a beat when she saw David's name on the screen. "We have him," David said, his voice electric with excitement. "One of the officers, Hendricks, has agreed to testify. He's ready to come forward." Amanda closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. For the first time since that night, she felt like justice was within reach. The morning of the trial dawned cold and overcast. The sky seemed heavy, as though it bore the same weight that Amanda carried in her chest. She stood in front of her small bathroom mirror, fixing the collar of her navy blue blouse. Her reflection stared back, calm, poised, but behind her eyes swirled a storm of emotions. Fear, anger, hope, and an almost unbearable pressure to see this fight through to the end. Alexander, Amanda's older brother, had flown in the night before. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a mix of admiration and concern. "You don't have to go through this alone, sis," he said softly. "I know," Amanda replied, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "But I need to face him. I need him to see that he didn't break me." Alexander nodded, his face hardening. "He'll see, and the world will see too." The courthouse was surrounded by protesters when Amanda and her team arrived. The crowd was larger than it had been at any of the previous demonstrations. People held signs bearing messages of solidarity and justice. "Hold police accountable." "Justice for Amanda." "End the abuse of power." The chants were deafening as Amanda stepped out of the car with David Morris, her attorney. Selena was close behind, carrying a large folder filled with evidence and witness testimonies. As soon as Amanda appeared, a roar of support erupted from the crowd. Reporters pushed forward, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her. "Amanda, how do you feel going into today's trial? Do you believe Officer Hampton will be held accountable? What do you say to critics who claim you're sensationalizing this case?" Amanda paused, looking straight into the nearest camera. Her voice was steady, clear, cutting through the noise. "This is not about sensationalism. This is about justice. I'm here today because no one, no matter their uniform, should be above accountability." David placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her into the courthouse. Inside, the air felt thick with tension. The corridors buzzed with the quiet conversations and the occasional murmur of lawyers briefing their clients. Amanda clenched her fists as she walked past a cluster of police officers, some in plain clothes. She could feel their eyes on her, some filled with disdain, others with unease. The courtroom was packed. Spectators filled every bench and journalists occupied the back rows, scribbling notes and snapping photos before the judge entered. At the front, Amanda sat beside David, her heart racing as she felt the full weight of the proceedings pressing on her shoulders. At the opposite table sat Officer Mark Hampton, dressed in a crisp suit that did little to soften his imposing presence. His smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, stony expression. Next to him sat his attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Robert Langley, who had a reputation for dismantling his opponents in court. "All rise," the bailiff called as the judge, an older black woman named Judge Beatrice Ellis, entered the room. Her stern gaze swept across the room as she settled into her chair. "This court is now in session to hear the case of Amanda Williams versus Officer Mark Hampton," Judge Ellis announced. "The plaintiff alleges abuse of power, unlawful detention, and harassment. The court will now hear opening statements." David stood first. He moved to the center of the courtroom, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, what happened to Amanda Williams was not an isolated incident. It was an egregious abuse of power carried out by someone who believed that his badge gave him the right to violate another human being. We will present evidence, witness testimonies, video footage, and accounts from other victims that show a pattern of behavior from Officer Hampton. This case is not just about one woman's experience. It is about a system that has allowed this behavior to go unchecked for far too long. Today, we will prove that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to enforce it." A murmur ran through the room as David returned to his seat. Amanda's heart lifted slightly at his words, the quiet confidence in his tone giving her strength. Langley rose next, his voice smooth and deliberate as he addressed the jury. "The defense will show that Officer Hampton acted well within his duties as a law enforcement officer. My client's actions were lawful, justified, and carried out with the intent to protect public safety. The claims made against him are exaggerated and unsupported by evidence. We ask that you consider the facts, not emotion, as we present our case. Amanda felt her stomach twist as Langley sat down. He was good, too good, but she trusted David and the mountain of evidence they had built. The first witness called to the stand was Amanda herself. She took a steadying breath as she walked to the front of the courtroom, swore to tell the truth, and took her seat. David approached her with a reassuring nod. "Amanda, can you describe what happened on the night of March 14th? Amanda's voice trembled slightly as she began, but it quickly grew stronger. She recounted every detail: the stop, Hampton's accusations, the humiliating pat-down, and the moment he forced her against her car, raising her skirt as bystanders watched. Her words were clear, deliberate, and the courtroom fell silent as she spoke. "What were you feeling in that moment?" David asked gently. "Humiliated," Amanda replied, her voice tight. "Violated, powerless. But I also felt something else. Anger. Because I knew what was happening was wrong, and I knew they thought they could get away with it." David nodded and stepped back, letting her words hang in the air. Langley stood, straightening his tie as he approached. "Miss Williams," he began, his tone sharp, "you claim you were humiliated and violated. But did Officer Hampton ever strike you? Did he physically harm you in any way?" Amanda stared at him, unflinching. "He didn't need to strike me to harm me. What he did was abuse. An abuse of power, of trust, of my dignity." Langley smirked faintly. "And yet, you're leading protests and media campaigns. Isn't it true that you're using this situation to further your personal agenda as an activist?" David objected immediately. "Irrelevant and inflammatory, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Ellis replied, giving Langley a pointed look. "Watch yourself, Mr. Langley." Amanda's testimony continued, unwavering, despite Langley's attempts to rattle her. By the time she returned to her seat, her hands were shaking, but her resolve remained intact. The most damning testimony came from Officer Hendricks. When he took the stand, the courtroom hushed, all eyes fixed on him. Amanda watched as he avoided Hampton's glare, his shoulders tense. David approached him carefully. "Officer Hendricks, you were present on the night of March 14th, correct?" "Yes," Hendricks said quietly. "Can you describe what happened?" Hendricks hesitated, glancing down at his hands. Then, with a deep breath, he looked up. Officer Hampton stopped Amanda Williams without cause. He escalated the situation, conducted an unnecessary and inappropriate search, and Hendricks' voice faltered. He lifted her skirt in front of everyone. It wasn't right. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Hampton's face flushed red as he shot Hendricks a look that could have cut glass. Langley tried to discredit Hendricks, implying that he was testifying out of jealousy or pressure, but the damage was done. Hendricks' words carried the weight of truth, and everyone in the room could feel it. Over the next several days, David presented testimony from other victims, each one recounting similar experiences with Hampton: humiliation, intimidation, and a pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. By the time closing arguments were made, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. David's voice rang clear as he addressed the jury. "This case is about accountability. It's about a man who thought his badge gave him the right to abuse others and a system that allowed him to keep doing it. But today, you have the power to say enough. To say that no one, no matter their uniform, is above the law." Langley's closing argument fell flat, his attempts to defend Hampton sounding hollow in the face of the evidence. When the jury returned with their verdict, the entire courtroom held its breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Hampton, guilty of abuse of power, harassment, and violation of civil rights. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Amanda's eyes filled with tears as she turned to David, who smiled and squeezed her shoulder. Across the room, Hampton slumped in his chair, his arrogance finally stripped away. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters swarmed Amanda, but she ignored them, stepping onto the steps to address the people who had stood by her. "This isn't just my victory," Amanda said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is a victory for all of us who refuse to be silenced. And this is only the beginning. We will keep fighting until justice isn't the exception. It's the norm." The crowd roared, their voices merging into a single, unstoppable force. Amanda looked out over them, feeling hope bloom in her chest. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who need to hear this message. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter, and be sure to check out our other videos for more powerful narratives. Together, let's make a difference.